Right, we'll go down this gangway first and stop down here. Okay, so on my left we have got an Austerity 280 locomotive built at Vulcan Foundry at Newton-le-Willows in 1945 as part of the war effort. This particular one never operated on British Rail, or British Railways I should say. It went straight from Newton-le-Willows across to the continent. First of all went to the Netherlands, and then from there it went up to Sweden. After the war, the Swedish Railways acquired her and used her on their freight services until they stopped using steam. The Swedes were a little bit more forward thinking than a lot of people though. I mean, you look at where we are today in the world with threats against electricity, threats to oil supplies and things like this. The Swedes were ahead of the game. They set up a strategic reserve of steam locomotives where they oiled them, greased them up and locked them away in a shed north of the Arctic Circle, just in case they needed them. Now they never did need them, and eventually came the day when they were getting rid of them, and this one was bought by a group of enthusiasts and brought back to the UK. She's currently coming, unbelievably, looking at her at the moment, towards the end of her restoration and overhaul. The boiler is currently over at Riley's at Bury. We were originally told she'd be back in steam by the end of this year. Unfortunately, they found a little problem with the boiler which needs extra work, so it looks as if it might not be now until sometime next year before she's back in service again, but she's on her way to it. When she does come back in service, she will carry the next number in the sequence that British Rail used, or British Railways used for these, a number that was never issued by British Railways. So she'll be in British Railways livery with a number that is authentic to the series but was never issued to a British Railways locomotive. Over on this side then, we've got a Great Western Railway 5700 class pannier tank. Now the Great Western Railway built hundreds of these. This particular one spent most of its working life with the Great Western Railway and British Railways down in South Wales. London Transport acquired a number of steam locomotives from the Metropolitan Railway, had used them on freight and passenger services on their non-electrified section out into Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire. When they electrified those lines fully out as far as they wanted to do so, they had no need for so many steam locomotives, and some of them were scrapped. The rest of them were starting to become life expired, so London Transport still needed steam locomotives for working engineers' trains over the Metropolitan and District line lines in and around London. British Railways sold London Transport a number of these pannier tanks, and this was one of them. When London Transport got rid of steam, they sold them off. A number of them went into preservation. This was one of them. Came to us. When it arrived here, it was in London Transport maroon livery. The livery it carries at the moment is a fictitious livery for the fictitious Great Northern and Southern Railway. It received that livery in 1970 for the original Railway Children film. That was the livery it carried for that. So this is one of our film style locomotives. When the last boiler certificate on this locomotive expired, it was taken up to the exhibition shed at Oxenhope and was in the exhibition shed until earlier this year, when she was brought down here to Haworth for assessment on what work needed to be done to bring her back to steam again. So what you see now is basically the bare frames and the cab. The boiler you'll see in a minute, the boiler and firebox you'll see in a minute, sat out on a wagon out in the yard, and it's next in line for work to start on it. Probably to start with concurrently with finishing off this one, and then it will take the place of that one in the works. Come this way. And then watch your footing across here. So, in the 1950s, British Railways were in the process of, continuing the process of, looking at their lesser used branch lines around the country, and a number of them were being closed. On the eastern region, in East Anglia, there are a number of rural branch lines which, while they perhaps weren't bringing in shed loads of money, they were providing an essential social service to the communities they served. So the eastern region of British Railways looked at how can we try and make these lines more economical. Now they'd heard that the German Federal Railways had a fleet of diesel rail buses very, very similar to these. So they sent a group of senior managers from Liverpool Street across to Germany to speak to the German Railways and have a look at their rail buses. And they came back and reported to the Eastern Region Board and said to them, yes, this is the way forward. These are the economics of these rail buses, and as a result the board recommended the purchase of 5 of these, built by the same manufacturers in Germany who built the German ones. These duly arrived in England via the Hook of Holland to Harwich train ferry. From Harwich they were taken to Cambridge, and that's where they were based for the majority of their working lives. From Cambridge Depot they worked out to Cambridge to Mildenhall, they worked Cambridge down the Stour Valley line via Haverhill and Sudbury, Chapel and Wakes Colne down to Marks Tay on the Liverpool Street Colchester line. They worked the branch from Haverhill down the Colne Valley parallel to that line that rejoined it at Chapel and Wakes Colne. They worked the line that ran from Bartlow between Haverhill and Cambridge via Saffron Walden to Audley End on the Cambridge-Liverpool Street line, and they also worked the 2 branches from Witham to Braintree, Witham to Malden East. They were quite successful. If we use the Saffron Walden branch, for example, as a good example, the Saffron Walden branch service in the main was Saffron Walden to Audley End, connecting with the main line. In the peak hours, morning and evening, you would have 1 or 2 services that would continue through to Bartlow, mainly serving the little halt at Ashton and serving Bartlow and bringing commuters and school children to and fro. So in the main their journeys were just over those 2 miles from Saffron Walden to the junction at Audley End. In the morning and evening peaks, these were full and standing. So much so, the guards would have difficulty opening and closing the doors. That's how successful they were. To a certain extent, they were a victim of their own success, because while they were successful in that respect, to replace them with a 2-car DMU like you see behind them would not have been so cost effective, because there would have been insufficient custom to fill one of those to the same extent. So in the end, they went. They moved en masse to Buxton up in Derbyshire, where they worked the lines from there prior to their withdrawal. Now, of the 5 that were built for British Railways, 4 of them still exist. We have 2 here on this railway, this one here and another one that's under restoration down at Ingrove. There is one at Chapel and Wakes Colne Station on the Stour Valley line at the East Anglian Railway Museum, and there is also one I believe it's at the Ribble Steam Railway over in Preston. This one we take out in the winter. It's a lovely little thing to work. I love working on this one when our traffic is quite low in numbers. Certainly couldn't use it today because all you guys would want to ride on it and we'd never get anywhere, would we? So, but yeah, it's quite a useful little vehicle. This one, Class 101 DMU, 2-car DMU, built by Metropolitan Cammell, Saltby in Birmingham. British Railways had quite a large fleet of Metropolitan diesel multiple units, various classes. Now this particular one was in service until earlier this year. We were fully aware of various bits of rust and corrosion that were starting to appear on her, so the decision was taken at the end of the winter timetable to take her out of service and to do some work on her. That work is now coming towards an end, towards a close, and she'll certainly be back in service later this year. She was in green livery when she was withdrawn from service earlier this year. When she comes back into service, she'll be in blue with full yellow ends. So just ringing the changes on the livery there. Now, I said to you earlier, didn't I? Diesel Gala, so most of the engines you're going to see are going to be steam. Now this one here is our oldest working locomotive on the railway. Built by Baker Peacock in Manchester in 1887. This was built for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. It was what they called their Type 27 goods locomotive. This particular one spent most of its working life in and around the Manchester area on shunting duties and on local freight duties. Another one of our film style locomotives. In the 1970s production of The Railway Children, this was the Green Dragon. And until last year, when she was repainted into the livery you see her in now, she was in a rather garish shade of green, let's put it that way. But she's been restored back into British Railways livery. Quite a useful little locomotive, despite her age, quite reliable little locomotive. Our steam gala back in February was infamous for the fact that the night before it snowed very heavily. On the first morning of our steam gala, it was still snowing quite heavily. I took a walk. I wasn't working on the first day of the steam gala on the railway, so I took a walk with my camera up into the woods below Ingro to see the trains coming through there with an eye to a photographic opportunity, and this thing came downhill tender first into the full eye of the blizzard. The crew huddled in the cab there. A little later on they saw sense and put a storm sheet up, but on that first downhill trip there was no storm sheet and they were huddled into the far back corners of the cab trying to get as much shelter as they could, which really gives you some idea of the conditions that the Victorian and certainly into BR steam days crews would have worked under at certain occasions. English Type 1 Bobo, otherwise known as the Class 20. Part of the modernisation programme of British Railways. British Railways in the 1950s were looking at getting rid of steam, and they slowly were, although strangely at that time they were still building steam as well. And at one point they were building steam and diesel locomotives alongside one another. So this was one of the early modernisation era locomotives. Now I always imagine the guy who was tasked with designing this, up until then he was probably used to steam locomotives. And his boss comes along one day and says to him, "Dear Fred, I want you to design me a diesel locomotive that will be equally at home on freight and on passenger, and anything else in between." So Fred sits down at his drawing board and he's got his pencil and he starts designing it. Right, what would we normally have on that? Oh, we'd probably have something like that there, wouldn't we? So we've got a tender and we've got an engine with 6 wheels underneath it. We've got a cab and a boiler and a dome and a funnel. Right, get the rubber out now. Let's rub off the tender. We don't need that. We don't need the dome. But we're going to need diesel engines. We're going to need fuel tanks. We're going to need or the electrical gubbins, so well, we could stick that where the boiler is, couldn't we? So there we got that bit. We don't know the chimney, we'll rub that off. We need a cab. Well, there you go, boss. There's my new diesel locomotive. Well, a flight of fancy maybe, but probably we may be closer to the truth than we actually think. Problem was, it had the same problems as a steam locomotive. You look at most steam locomotives, you know, that one's got a fairly small boiler. You can see over the top of it to a certain extent through those spectacle plates on the front there. But majority of them, you can't see over the top of the boiler. Your driver's looking down one side and your fireman's looking down the other side, and you can't see the full width, especially on a line that curves. Similar problem on this. So, British Railway's solution was to work these in pairs, coupled nose to nose, so your cab is at the outer end. And if you look at the cab at this end, you've got two lovely big windows. You can see the full width of the line ahead of you. This particular one travelled all over the country, this one. Right from Kitty Brewster, right up in Aberdeenshire in the north east of Scotland, all the way down to Stratford, the biggest shed in London, working out from Stratford around East London and East Anglia. And in between, various places around the country, Thornaby up on Teesside, Tinsley down in Sheffield, working round the East Midlands coalfields, so hauling steel, hauling coal, and anything in between. Come across this way. Come across this way, folks. So, here we have a British Railways Standard Class 2 260 tender locomotive, designed by a gentleman by the name of Robert Riddles. Now, Mr. Riddles started out his railway career with the London Midland and Scottish Railway. He was a pupil of Ivat, one of the London Midlands chief mechanical engineers. Look at this locomotive, and when we get into the stone shed, you will see the Ivat 262 tank. When you see the Ivat, just remember what this one looks like, because they are very, very similar because of Ivat's influence. Designed for ease of access to all the mechanical parts. All the standard class locomotives and all of Ivat's designs had a high running plate. So here's your high running plate, under which you've got all your motion. Your motion in between the frames was easily accessible. You didn't necessarily need to drop the wheels out for a small job like you did on some of the older locomotives. You could get in between quite easily. Sometimes you could even reach stuff without having to go in between. You could reach it from the outside. All designed for ease of maintenance and being able to replace parts fairly quickly. So a lot of work, minor jobs, could be carried out on a shed rather than have to go to a major depot or to the works. Now, this one spent most of its time in the northwest of England. Don't be fooled by Mahuntleth painted on the buffer beam. Until very recently, she had Mahuntleth's shed plate on the front as well, 89C. Also the green livery. The standard class engines that bore the green livery in the main were those that were designed and designated for express passenger work. It was only on the Western region, or the Great Western region as they still like to call themselves, right up into the 1960s, where green paint was applied to lesser locomotives. Now this one never worked on the Western region under British Railways, but what happened in the 1980s, British Rail ran a number of steam excursions on the Cambrian coastline from the Huntleth up to Keighley, along that lovely bit of coastal line. And this locomotive was one of those that worked those trains. Hence it acquired Huntleth on the buffer beam, and it also acquired the lined green livery. Over in that corner there is a Class 25. Unfortunately, sadly, that one's not worked for a few years and probably is unlikely to work for a few more years yet. Just above Haworth Station, we enter the valley of the Bridge House Beck. The Worth Valley south of Haworth, Bridge House Beck Valley north of Haworth, and a couple of years ago the Bridge House Beck overflowed during the winter and flooded the railway and flooded the shed. And unfortunately, the water got into the traction motors of the Class 25. Now, traction motors, electric traction motors and water are not good bedfellows. It hasn't worked ever since. There's been a little bit of an argy-bargy with the insurance company over whether or not they're going to pay and how much they're going to pay and things like this. And in the meantime, it sits there sidelined until we get to the point where we need to restore it. We don't need to at the moment. We have got the Class 20, we've got our own Resident 37, they stand us in very good stead, and if push comes to shove, we've always got other locomotives which are equally at home on our passenger service as they are on a works train, so she sits there for the time being. Let's go out into the yard here, folks. Just mind those buffer beams, don't rub against that, because that would spoil your day, that would. So I probably don't need to introduce this one to you, to very many of you at all, really, do I? Yeah, it's an 08 diesel shunter, if you like, almost British Rail's standard diesel shunter for so many years. They had hundreds of these on the fleet, and they were virtually every point round the system, from the far north to the far south, from the east to the west. This particular one built at Darlington Works in 1957. She worked all over the place during her career. There's not many major depots in the eastern and the London Midland region that she hasn't been to at one point or another. Spent some time at Shirebrook, as you can see from the sticker on the side. Useful little locomotive. We'll see another one a little while, which is slightly different to this one. But, yeah, so it's a useful little locomotive. We use it a fair bit in various works trains and things like this, and a passenger service is not beyond the realms of this one, although it would be restricted on speed, very much restricted on speed. So here's the boiler of the 57 pannier, sitting there waiting to be worked on. Right, for this next bit, just be very, very careful with your footing across here, and please do not stray into that pit. I mentioned pits to you earlier. You don't want to go down there. If you cross over here to the pits, we don't normally bring visitors across to this point on these shed tours, but we advertise the presence of the 144 and the 143 for this weekend, so we're bringing you down to have a look at them. So, this end of the lineup, we've got a 144. It's in Yorkshire, West Yorkshire Metro train livery that it carried in the 1980s. Worked on all the lines around West Yorkshire, out of Bradford and Leeds. And is a very fitting unit to have on this line. Of course, they never worked on this line under BR service because, of course, by the time they were introduced, the line was in preservation hands. But we did have, during the pandemic, an awful number of Northern's fleet stored in Haworth Station, in the two platform roads at Haworth Station for a while, because normally the way the companies that Northern work is that the majority of their units are out in service. They're only on shed if they've got a problem or they're coming for routine service. So the majority of the time in the timetable you'll find most of them are out somewhere on the network. And overnight, those that don't have to go back to Neville Hill for work will be stable at somewhere like Skipton or Bradford or wherever, in some sidings somewhere. So the problem they had was that during the pandemic, when all services ceased for a while, where the hell do we put all these units we've got? Because normally we don't need space for all of them, because they're somewhere else on the network. And we were able to offer them the two platform roads at Keighley to stable them for a while. We walk down this side, just watch your footing, be very, very careful what you're footing down here. Not in service at the moment. Well, that one is on a normal weekend at the moment with the 101 out of service. This would probably run one service while we'd have steam on the other service. So if you've all got your photographs of that one, we'll go into the stone shed. Okay folks, so here we have a Taff Vale Railway 01 class 06 2-tank, built in 1899 by Nielsen Reid in Glasgow for the Taff Vale Railway. Now the Taff Vale Railway was one of those South Wales railways that ran up from Cardiff, up the valleys, up into the Rhondda valleys, up to Aberdare, up to Merthyr Tydfil. This particular locomotive was of a class that would have been used to haul the coal down from the valleys down to Cardiff and Penarth for shipping out from the ports, and would have then pulled the empty wagons back up again to the collieries for loading again. Now when the Great Western Railway acquired the railways of the South Wales valleys in 1922, they immediately looked at this collection of locomotives they've acquired and thought, a bit like licorice all sorts, what a lot we've got. Because they had all varieties from virtually every manufacturer in the country, because none of those smaller companies built their own locomotives. They were all contracted out to people like Nielsen Reid, Hudswell Clark, Hunslet, Avonside, people like that. So the Great Western Railway set about their standardisation process. Oh, where have we heard that before? So they started getting rid of a lot of these pre-grouping locomotives almost immediately. This one left the Great Western in 1927. She was sold to the Lambton, Hetton and Joycey Colliery Company up in the northeast, up in Durham, in the Durham coalfield. And she was sent up there to work the colliery lines up there. Now that company had quite an extensive network of lines linking their collieries with the docks at Sunderland. Part of their route had a very restricted loading gauge because of some structures along that route. So they rebuilt the cab, and the cab was rebuilt with inward sloping sides at sort of the top of the tanks, and then a roof, a normal sort of roof over the top. And that's the condition she was in when she was withdrawn by the National Coal Board and she came here. So when she arrived here, the cab you see now is of the design she would have had originally when built by Nielsen Reed for the Taff Vale. That cab was built here in our works here at Haworth. So she was rebuilt back into Taff Vale condition here at Haworth. She's a lovely little locomotive, quite a powerful one, as you'd imagine, having hauled coal trains up and down the South Wales valleys, and she'll quite happily handle our passengers all day long. Can I just come past you guys? Yeah. We'll leave you to get on with what you're doing.
From the best cat, there's nobody using brains.
So I feel we're going to have it down here for a second.
Oh, right, okay.
So,
I'm going out there, so I'll be
you're going up there,
there.
right mate, no problem. So this building we're in now, we call the Stone Shed, of course was the original goods shed for Haworth and the surrounding area. Quite a substantial building, as you can see. If you look along here, you've got three doorways. This one's been blocked off, but the other two are still extant at either end. Two-storey building. Upper floor, the entire length of it. If you look up there, you can see a hatchway to the upper floor, where at one time there would have been a hoist that would have used to hoist goods up onto the upper level where it could be stored. When we get down the far end there, you can just see the spiral staircase going to the upper level. You'll see that in more detail when we get down to that end. Another original feature of this building. Up onto the platform and we'll have a look at these two locomotives. So here we have a British Railways standard class 4 460. This particular one was built at Swindon Works, but then spent all its working life with British Railways on the southern region. Her first shed after she was released to traffic from Swindon Works was at Exmouth Junction, just outside Exeter Central Station, from where she worked up the South West Main Line into Waterloo. From Exmouth Junction she moved closer to London. She went to Basingstoke, working the lines around about Basingstoke, and again continuing to work up and down the South West Main Line. Then her final shed before withdrawal was Nine Elms, just outside Waterloo, again working up and down that South West Main Line. When she was withdrawn from service, she went to the Steam Locomotive Supermarket of South Wales, Woodham Scrapyard down at Barry. And from there she was rescued and brought to preservation, like so many other locomotives that we still have in service around the country today. Now, the Woodham brothers ran a very successful scrap business right up into the 1990s. But back in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, they were buying a lot of stuff from British Railways, a lot of wagons, and it was the wagons that resulted in us having so many steam locomotives in preservation today that came out of Barry Scrapyard, because the wagons were a whole lot easier to scrap. The wagons had two main components, steel and wood. To get rid of the wood, you set fire to the wagon. What you're left with then is the steel framework, the steel components. That can then be cut up with an acetylene torch in very short order, and that can then be sold on to the steel works to be melted down again and used in new steel and all other things that it was used for. In the meantime, these steam locomotives sat in a series of sidings down at Barry, rusting away, because scrapping one of these was a whole more complex job. They're not all just steel. Some have got copper fireboxes. Now, copper, a totally different metal. a far more valuable metal in some cases than steel was. So you've got two different sets of metal here, using different techniques for dealing with and having different markets for the woodens to sell them onto. In the meantime, railway enthusiasts were flocking to Barry, and I can recall going to Barry in the 1970s and having a wander around their yard there, and so many of these locomotives had daubed in emulsion paint on the side, reserved for some preservation outfit you'd never heard of, and didn't get very far. But we have so much to be thankful to the Wooden brothers for, in terms of steam locomotives that still exist today, including this beastie here. Now, when we were looking at Standard Class 2, I mentioned Ivat. I mentioned the fact that Robert Riddles, who designed so many of the Standard Class locomotives, was a pupil of Ivat. So here we have one of Ivat's thoroughbred products. This is an Ivat Class 2 262 tank. And I said to you, bear in mind what the Standard Class 2 looks like as a tender locomotive. Now look at this. And you'll see immediately the similarities in the design, the angles and everything else, the ease of maintenance. Unfortunately, most of its running gear is hidden below the platform, but from what you can see that if you were stood down there, it's so easy to get to. It's so easy to maintain. Now, this particular one, this is a fairly local engine. This, towards the end of its life on British Railways, was allocated to Skipton Shed, just up the main line from Keighley. Skipton had a duty that they sent a locomotive out on every single day. They'd send a locomotive down from Skipton to Keighley. Now Keighley had two goods yards. It had the Midland goods yard, where Sainsbury's supermarket is, opposite the railway station now, and they also had the Great Northern goods yard, which you can see from our train as you climb out of Keighley on the right hand side, where Hugh Gray builders merchants are. That building they use is the old Great Northern goods shed. So every day Skipton would send a locomotive down from the shed at Skipton down to Keighley to shunt the two yards. Quite a busy little duty at one time, because with the two yards, with the various lines coming into Keighley, there was a fair bit of traffic. Notwithstanding the amount of traffic that used to come off this branch at one time. Towards the end, however, the locomotive would sit in one of the goods yards at Keighley for most of the day, not doing a great deal. The crew would be sat on the footplate there. They'd probably be talking about the latest football or rugby league results, maybe doing the crossword, having a smoke, having a brew. And at the end of their duty, they'd ring off to the box and off they'd go back up the main line to Skipton, on the shed, book off, home. Skipton Shed was coming up for closure, and a number of our members approached British Railways, and British Railways offered them not one of these, but two of these. Unfortunately, they only had enough money to buy one. What a different story it would have been if they could have had a few more pounds and could have bought the two of them. But anyway, we got the one, and it came here. Now, at the time, of course, British Railways was still using steam. So there was a clause written into the contract of any steam locomotive that they sold at that time that stated that if it was going to be used as a steam locomotive on a railway, whether it be an industrial siding or whether it be a preserved line like this, it could not wear British Railways livery, it could not carry British Railways livery. So she got painted into this livery, with KWVR and the railway's crest on the side tanks. That satisfied that clause. She has in preservation been in British Railways black. Subsequent to that stipulation being lifted when British Rail did away with steam in 1968, she went back into British Railways livery, but then on her subsequent overhaul she went back into this livery by popular demand from the members of the railway. It's quite fortuitous really, because last year she went down to the North Norfolk Railway at Sheringham for their steam gala, and what a fantastic advert she was for the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. She appeared on regional television down there, she appeared in all the local and regional newspapers down there with the coverage that they gave the North Norfolk's gala, and so many visitors were asking the North Norfolk staff, well, what does that mean on the side of that loco? Where's that from? And they would tell them. And I know from my own experience here on this line, after she came back from North Norfolk, we quite often would have visitors here who came to us because they'd been to the North Norfolk when she was there and subsequently had found out about our railway and said, let's go and see that railway, and they came to visit us. So fantastic bit of publicity for us. Come round the corner here, we get a better view of the spiral staircase. Really is a masterpiece of engineering when you look at it, and how it must have been all been put together with the component parts going up to the upper floor there. Fantastic survivor of the industrial age. Behind you, no steam depot in its day would have been complete without a board like this that told the shed foreman exactly what locos he'd got on shed. And there's no exception here. This is our steam depot. So it really is, British Railways in more recent years, British Rail in more recent years, have used the TOPS computer to keep track of all their locomotives and rolling stock. So this is the TOPS computer of the pre-computer age. Quite a simple system really. You've got your locomotive numbers down here. You would have the date of the last boiler inspection, the date of the last mechanical inspection, and then you've got your days in steam across here. You have spaces where you can put any particular work that needs to be undertaken, the date it was undertaken on. So we have our steam locomotives down here, we have our diesels over there. We have a simple colour code on this railway. If it's red, it means it's not available for traffic. If it's got a green diamond, then it is available for traffic. It might not be in steam at the moment, like these two down the road here, but all we've got to do with those, fill up the water, light a fire, raise steam, and in a few hours' time, they're fit for traffic. So at the moment we've got 85, the Taff Vale tank is stopped for a boiler washout. But otherwise, majority of the others are in service. We've got one down here without a tag, 60103. I wonder how long that one will stay on there. She's been gone here now for about a fortnight, nearly 3 weeks.
Flying Scotsman.
Flying Scotsman, yeah. But while she was here, she was on the board because she was available for traffic. And she was in traffic, of course. So I expect that will stay on there for quite a while. Not many sheds have that number on their board, do they? And this one, Bahamas Locomotive Society, so that's Bahamas. Of course, she's away on the main line at the moment. Various parts around the country. As I say, similar with the diesels here. So we've got 3 diesels stopped at the moment. Merlin, the Class 25, and then the 089, the cut down 08, which I'll try and get you a glimpse of as we go out the shed. The 089s were a subclass of the 08s. There were 5 of them in total. Little branch line down in southwest Wales, running from Buddyport up the Gwendryve Valley to Cwm Mawr. In steam days, the Buddyport and Gwendryve Valley Railway had a collection of industrial type locomotives built by people like Chapman and Furneaux, Avonside. The Great Western Railway kept those for a lot longer than they did some of the other similar sort of locomotives they acquired from various other companies. But by the 1950s, the last of the Buddyport and Gwendryve Valley locos had gone. They were replaced in time, over time, with members of the 2021 class of pannier tanks, and then latterly by the 1600 class pannier tanks. When dieselisation came along, British Railways had a bit of a problem, because one of the issues on the Buryport and Gwendryve Valley line was that it was built on the bed of an old canal. Originally, when the pits up the Gwendryve Valley were opened, to get the coal out of the valley, they built a canal, and they took it by barge down to Buryport. They saw how successfully the South Wales Railway and later the Great Western Railway were moving stuff on the main line at Buryport, and the directors of the various colliery companies all banded together, and eventually they built a railway. They built the railway by the simple and very cheap expedient of draining the canal and laying the track on the bed of the canal. That gave them two problems. The first one was, when it rained, the canal tended to fill up again in places. Particularly there was a section between where it crossed underneath the main line at Buryport and a short section round there towards Trimsaran Road, where it became a canal again. So much so that there was a strict instruction that there were level boards along there, like you find by some of the rivers where roads reach them, showing you the depth of the water. And if the water got to 10 inches or more, all traffic had to stop, because that was the point at which the water might start making its way into fireboxes, with obvious consequences. So when it came to dieselisation, they couldn't use anything with electrical transmission. Electricity and water, not a good bedfellow. So they took a number of 03 diesel mechanical shunters, and because they wouldn't fit under the bridges without modification, they lowered them by they lowered the bodies by 4 inches by a simple expedient of taking a slice off at the bottom of the cabs and a slice off at the top of the bonnets. And they worked quite happily through until the 1990s, when they were starting to become a bit worn out and life expired. What do? What we do is we close the section between Buryport and Trimsaran Road, and we reopen a section that closed many years ago between Keighley on the main line and Trimsaran Road, which didn't flood. Still had low bridges in places, so they took 5 08s and they took a top slice off those the entire length to reduce them in height to go under the bridges, creating the 089 subclass. Now, that was fine and dandy as long as you only used those. Trouble was, down at Buryport, which was quite a busy yard at one time, they had a couple of full-size 08s that used to just shunt the yard. One particular day, one of the 089s failed up the branch, the phone call came down, and the yard foreman opens the window, shouts out the window, "Di, take so-and-so up the valley and go and rescue the train." So Di goes and takes a locomotive. Unfortunately, he took a full-size one. Off he went, happily trundling up the line as fast as an 08 would go, which is about 20 miles an hour. Got to the first bridge, he hit it with a resounding clunk and created the first italic 08 and the only italic 08 ever in history, because he knocked the whole body back by 45 degrees. They never made that mistake again, but that's why you had the 089s. Come this way. Now as you come through here, folks, we're going down the original steps here, which are showing their age. They're stone, they're a bit worn, so the treads are a bit uneven. Probably see it better from around the other side. Okay, come in. Aha, there you go. This is the wheel drop building. So we're very fortunate that we have a working wheel drop. Not many preserved lines have a wheel drop. If you go to the Great Western Society at Didcot, If they want to take a set of locomotive wheels out, they've got a big gantry and they hoist up the one end or the other of the locomotive and move the wheels out. We do it this way. We'll bring a locomotive in on here. You'll remove the coupling rods, you'll undo all the other gubbins, and then you lower, you want to take that set of wheels out, you'll lower that table, and that goes down into the pit with the wheels on it. You can then move the rest of the locomotive out, and then once it's clear, you can bring that set of wheels up and you can do what you like with it. Some places, if they had a wheel drop like this, would have had a gantry where you could hoist the wheel set out and move it to somewhere, or you pinch bar it out and then into wherever it needs to go to be worked on. So we're quite fortunate we've got this. We don't use it very often, but it is handy to have. However, here we have another one of our film style locomotives, and this is United States Army Transportation Corps S-160 Class 280 locomotive. Similar in some respects to the Austerity, the WD Austerity 280, which we've got the frames of in the shed. This was built by the Lima Works in Ohio in 1945, towards the tail end of the Second World War, and it was shipped direct across to Europe. She went across to Europe, and as the Allied forces advanced through what had previously been German-occupied Europe, she went hauling materials trains, military trains, as the front moved back and back and back. Come the end of the Second World War, she was in Poland. Now Poland, at the end of the Second World War, of course, became Soviet territory. Soviet at that time were an ally of the Americans. Sort of. It was a bit of a rocky alliance, but they were an ally. They were on our side. So she was behind the Iron Curtain, of course, in Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War. And she worked with the Polish State Railways quite happily until they withdrew her. Now, they wanted to put her into their equivalent of the National Railway Museum. However, anything and everything that occurred behind the Iron Curtain in those days was strictly controlled by the Soviets. And when the Soviets heard of this plan to put an American-built locomotive into a museum in their territory, there was a big fat niet. No, under no circumstances. So the Poles were a little bit upset because they wanted to preserve this locomotive really as a reminder, if you like, of what Poland had gone through during the Second World War and how the Allies had helped liberate their country and helped them, and as a symbol of the friendship between Poland and the United States and the United Kingdom. So they were quite upset about this. Now, fortunately at the time, one of our members was a member of the Diplomatic Corps, and he just happened to be stationed at the British Embassy in Poland. Being a railway enthusiast, of course, he got a lot of contacts in Polish railways, and of course was taking every opportunity he could in his downtime to go and visit various places and talking to some of his friends. They told him about this locomotive, and he says, "Leave it with me, I'll make some phone calls." The upshot of it was, A, she found a new home here on the Keighley Valley Railway. B, through the good offices of the Swiss ambassador, of course the Swiss being neutral, he managed to persuade the Soviets to let it leave the country. So it came across via Hull on the ferry and on a low loader along the M62 back to Yorkshire. When it arrived, it was still in Polish black livery with all its continental adornments that the Poles had added onto it over the years, and then subsequently was restored back into the condition you see. Now, I called her a film style locomotive. That she most definitely is. Her first appearance on the celluloid screen was in a film called Yanks. Something to do about the American war effort, you know, how the Americans won the war single-handedly, even though they only entered it in 1942. Starring a minor film star, somebody called Richard Gere. I don't know if you've heard of him, folks, but yeah. a minor film really. So this is the star, or one of the stars, of The Railway Children Returns, the most recent Railway Children film that was filmed entirely on this railway, filmed entirely in Yorkshire. All the railway sequences were filmed on this railway. A lot of the non-railway sequences were filmed in and around Haworth and Saltaire. For example, the American camp in the film was actually filmed down at Salt's Mill at Saltaire, and a lot of the scenes that would have been filmed in studios in somewhere like Manchester or Liverpool or London, they were actually filmed on specially constructed sets in our exhibition shed up at Oxenhope. And Big Jim, as we affectionately call her, she hauled the train that took the cast, the entire cast, down to Keighley for the world premiere when it was held last year at the Picture House Cinema in Keighley. Quite a coup for Yorkshire, for Keighley and for the railway, because world premieres with the full star cast are usually held in places like London, in the West End, but not on this occasion. It was held here in Yorkshire, locally in the cinema in town. About a week later they held the premiere, not the world premiere, the premiere somewhere in the West End, and only the main stars like Jenny Agutter actually went to the main premiere, whereas they'd all come to Yorkshire for the world premiere. So that just about concludes your shed tour. If you've got any questions, say more than happy to answer them if we can, but if not, we'll take you back out and back towards the station, and you can enjoy the rest of your visit to the Keighley-Worth Valley Railway and the rest of your day at the Diesel Gala.
Thank you very much.
No, you're welcome.
Have you just got a different outfit or a different manufacturer?
Yes, I know. Over the years, it's probably acquired little bits because, of course, Alco were building, you know, these like the WD Torettos were built by a number of different manufacturers, weren't they? So, I mean, over the years, I expect Poland probably had some Alcos, and yeah, like we did on.
I'm just telling your colleague a bit of useless information.
Sure.
You know the Class 20 diesel loco?
Yes.
The actual engine inside it
Yes.
is still used in passenger services in Portugal.
Are they? Oh, yes, they are. That's right. They are. Yes, yes, they are. Yes, yes, I've seen photographs of them. You've got sort of orange and
If you get the chance,
orange and white livery that they use, isn't it? Or did at one time?
absolutely superb
Is it?
line.
Oh, right. I've got a friend who lives in Poland. I'll have to
Excuse me,
Portugal, not
Just-
Poland.
any chance of a glimpse of that 08993?
Yeah, do you want to see these out, Ross? And I'll
Please.
see if I can get this gent round. I didn't take you down round because it is tight through here.
Yeah.
I was hoping we could get to it down the side, but it gets tighter down towards the bottom end. I have a little soft spot for this one because I lived in Southie for a while, and in fact I went out with a girl from the Green Drive Valley and I was living in Southie. So I have a little soft spot for this particular one.
One of the last 08s I ever needed.
Any objections to me just wandering down there to get the number off the unit?
Um,
Or is it?
we can probably
Get that from
get
round
that
that
from
side.
the
Right.
yard actually.
Yeah.
We'll probably get that from the yard. That's probably not going to. And it's
Right, thank you
that
very much.
one is the sister of that one over there.
Okay.
They're off the same unit.